Okay, so I think we can start. We have a good number of people with us.
Okay.
Um, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another one of our lecture series in development studies. We're really happy to have with us Professor Mary John. Professor Mary John is a towering figure in the field of women's studies and in the arena of feminist politics. She's been working in this field for many years now. She's a professor based at the Center for Women's Development Studies, that is a center based in Delhi. Um, she's currently the acting director and also has been the director of the institute in the past from 2006 to 12. She was also the deputy director of the Women's Studies program at JNU from 2001 to 6. She's published widely in the field of women's studies and in the field of feminist politics, and has been an important scholar that many of us have grown up on, formed our ideas and opinions and our understanding and analysis from. So we're really happy to have her with us. She's also, published on a whole range of issues, and I'm not going to sort of go through the publications, but her latest book that's co-edited with Professor Meena Gopal is called Women in the Worlds of Labor, Interdisciplinary and Intersectional Perspectives. And so she's going to be speaking also based on this latest work that they've worked on. She's also worked closely with both the UGC in the past around questions of how to make universities safe spaces, gender sensitization, etc., and has also worked on a range of very important reports working with UN Women and with UNFPA. So with that very short, brief, quick introduction, we'd like to welcome Professor Mary John. And I'll sort of hand it over to you. Welcome, Professor John. And, like you said, about 45 minutes is also good. And then we'll follow it by a discussion.
Well, a warm good afternoon to all of you, and many thanks to Vasundhara and your team for having me. I'm not sure, I actually wasn't quite sure what kind of presentation or discussion you would work for all of you at IIT Guwahati. But what I actually was going to present is coming from the very volume that Vasundhara mentioned on women's labor. In fact, one of the chapters in that volume is what I would like to present on. I hope you won't find it too boring, because it's a somewhat analytical presentation, one where, even though the work is published, it's ongoing work. It's actually an effort to share with you, an effort to bring together thinking that is much more taken for granted in, say, Western contexts of theoretical work on Marxism and feminism. And what both Meena and I found was that we have had a long history in India of debating and concern over women's labor and the very special and sometimes, in fact, shocking and sometimes not even well-known characteristics of women's labor in India. But what was for us a shortcoming was not that not the fact that it was not well known. In fact, one of the concerns that I have now been articulating in many forums is that when we think of women's issues in India, and especially in recent years, the very a strong and immediate connection, and rightfully so, is made with violence, and violence has become almost the face of what is wrong in a country like ours when we think of women, and have been associated with issues around that. But there is a shortcoming there, and a blindness, it seems to us, when that becomes the actual face of it, or when that is seen as somehow the most important issue that needs to be addressed. So it's in that light that we have been looking at ways to open up the question of labor in a relationship with a field of knowledge and long debates in Western contexts that might, and we'll end maybe with that, to say that how are the ways in which we can make the links more useful, because we can't only rest with description, which is the best that we have often done in a context like ours, trying to measure women's work and give value to it through those ways, is important, is inescapable, but is insufficient. What could we learn maybe from the ups and downs and from the complex fortunes of debates elsewhere to make sense of our situation? So I will begin with some remarks on the history of how labor has been looked at in what has been, I think, the most uh, uh, well-known and well-regarded body of thought on issues around labor, which is Marxism, which unfolded and then had many moments in the subsequent, in the 20th century, when feminism made its, built a relationship with Marxism in many different ways. So the first sort of point to make is that when we think about our standard, I mean our ways of thinking are such that we always, when we think of Marxism and feminism, we think of the body of Marxism as coming first. We think of it as the major body of work, and we think of feminism as only in relationship to Marxism, which is actually historically not right. It's historically incorrect, insofar as it was prior to Marxism. In fact, there was a socialist tradition in the West in the early 19th century, very deliberately socialist, and in fact, Marx talks about that, that articulated what Marx then came to call the women's question long before Marx. And it was these early socialists in the early 19th century that actually did something quite remarkable for their time, which was to articulate the issue as a twin problem, as a problem. The problem of society was not just capitalism and its exploitation of workers. The problem was equally the use and exploitation of women as property. And these were twin concerns that they brought together and sought to overcome by looking at the family and marriage institution as much as they looked at property relations and work relations. And it is this that, in fact, Marx inherits in the middle of the 19th century, when he then embarks on what is, I think, very well known to many, his very, very in-depth analysis of capital and the capital-labor relation, within which then he places in a sort of much vaguer way what is called the women's question. And for Marxists at that time, well into the 20th century, issues of the wrongs of women, issues of women's equality or inequality were articulated very deliberately using this term, the women's question. The word feminism itself, by the way, is a late 19th century term. It's a French term. It means literally, feminism literally means femme-ism, means womanism. It means it was coined as a way to talk about, much like other isms of the time, what are the rights that for women. That was what feminism was. But for communists at that time, for Marxists at that time, there was a very strongly negative, I should say, judgment against those who were fighting for women's liberation and women's rights in politics, the suffragettes and others, because they were seen as bourgeois, as only looking for equal rights in terms of property relations, in terms of rights, in terms of liberal rights. And hence they rejected that vision of rights for women or equality for women, in contrast to which they articulated a socialist vision. And so the primary way in which, till for many, many decades, the primary face of the women's question in Marxism was that women should be side by side with men, that socialism was the horizon, and that if women were to gain the rights of workers and fight alongside with workers, in other words, working class men, then indeed and if they could gain independence in these ways, then in fact their economic dependence on men would also be overcome. So the curious thing here, though, and that this is, I think, not often noticed, is that when and Engels talks about this, Marx talks about, is the first, the very famous feminists. So I mean, I'm calling them feminists communist women of the time, like Clara Zetkin and so on, when all of them, and in fact, Clara Zetkin starts a newspaper called Equality in the end of the 19th century. What they don't realize, even as they're opposing what they think of as bourgeois feminism, those middle class women who only want, rights, bourgeois rights, in other words, what they call bourgeois rights of property and so on, which they wanted to see overcome in a new society. What they don't realize is that they're actually employing a lot of the language of liberalism. In fact, the word equality, which Marx was very, how shall I say, extremely critical of, because he felt that the equality that liberal theory was providing was a fake equality. And then the most profound notion of fake equality for him was the relationship that the worker had to the wages that they got. For him, it hid the most profound exploitation in terms of production. That in fact, that in the name of equality, there was in fact a profound inequality. They were very, very critical of parliamentary rights and so on, as actually all obfuscating, not paying attention to the much more deeper levels of exploitation in the economy. So what is ironical in a sense, and that's something for us, I don't think even in Marxism's and thinking about Marxism, we have recognized this, that even though they were up against or opposed to the feminisms of the time, they were actually very indebted to it, and they often employed a very similar horizon. So the assumption, for instance, that if working class women were to gain the rights of working class men, then their dependence on men would cease. Is not very different from what liberals would also say, that women should enter the public sphere, that they should be part of that kind of sphere. And in fact, the home, the sphere that I will talk about shortly, does not figure very much in amongst these early Marxists, and including the women who were part of that movement. It's much later. It's actually mid 20th century. You could say the next wave, if you want to use the language of waves, of the women's movement in the West, the 1960s and 70s, that sees a very new way of actually rethinking Marxism. And Marxism at that time in the 1960s and 70s was probably the most prominent, of course, liberal thought never went away and conservative ways of thinking have never gone away. But I would say that especially in the social sciences, in the 1960s, there was a very major revival of Marxist ways of thinking. A kind of new Marxism emerges. And within the women's movement, there is also an acknowledgement of Marxism. But at the same time, there is a kind of, I would say, a much more imaginative way of no longer simply inserting working class women within the horizon of Marxist thought, but rather ways of using Marxist theory in analogical ways or in turning almost Marxism upside down. One of the most, and there have been, I don't know if you've been reading or seeing some recent discussions that have been happening. There was a very interesting, short-lived, but very, very interesting movement in the 1960s and 70s called Wages for Housework, which has suddenly found a new life in the last few years and has even begun to be debated in India. It's very interesting that at this point in time, it should find a new life. And the idea behind Wages for Housework, is worth revisiting this idea, which emerged in Britain and in Italy in the late 1960s and 70s, which was in a way taking Marxist theory to a different level altogether. So if Marx was saying that there is a hidden abode of production within the factory and so on, where in fact exploitation happens by capital of the worker, they said there's an even more hidden abode that enables the worker to come to work every morning refreshed and ready to be exploited by the capitalist. And this is the sphere of the home. It is in the home that, in fact, another relationship exists within which a whole range of labors have to be undertaken, of care, of reproduction, of cleaning, of cooking, of sexual, you name it, all the various ways in which labors are undertaken but are unpaid, unacknowledged, given no value, but which are nonetheless critical. And the brilliance of their formulation was not that this was, which is what we are very used to thinking in terms of today. They weren't saying this is an inequality between men and women. This is not for them the problem of men not doing their share of housework. They were making a very different point. They were saying that this kind of unpaid work in the home is a giant subsidy to capitalism, right? So, in other words, that behind the labor of the worker is an even more hidden abode of the labor of the wife and other members of the family that are actually reproducing the worker who goes to the factory gates or goes to the job, where in fact, he or she, it could even be a she, be exploited. But if the unpaid aspect of what that work of the work that goes into the reproduction of the labor is not, in fact, part of the equation. And if indeed, so this is not about men sharing work with women, this is about the state and capital not recognizing. It is an unpaid wage on the part of the state and on the part of capital that would need to be acknowledged. If indeed it were acknowledged, it would lead to the collapse of capitalism, because capitalism would not be able to pay this enormous, subsidy and survive. So the politics of the wages of housework, which I think has gotten a little lost now, needs to be understood for what it was. It was a battle. It was a way in which the housewife, so to say, could join the battle against capitalism. And it's the purpose, therefore, of the idea of the wage was to destabilize capitalism on its own in terms, in a Marxist understanding that went beyond what Marx himself or anyone had thought of. So this was a very interesting moment that was highly controversial, sometimes misunderstood, but sometimes argued around, and has been revived today. Others joined that debate and said that in spite of the fact that capitalism might be the horizon or might be the actual center of these kinds of this concern and of this understanding of politicizing housework in relation to capitalism, that one should not lose sight of the fact that it was invariably women who were in this position of unpaid work in the home, and that there was, in fact, and this is what I discuss in that chapter, that it was not simply a relationship with capitalism, but that there was also, and Heidi Hartmann is the figure here who argues in the late 70s that there was practically, historically, if you look at the debates, once the worst aspects of capitalism in the 19th century had been overcome and it was settling down by the early 20th century, she feels that there was actually almost like a pact between between working class men and capitalists to keep women at home. It was in the interest of both of them, in fact, to prevent women from stepping out and for them to be undertaking unpaid labor in the home. And the way that was sort of the way in which men were bought off, as it were, was by offering what was called a family wage. So the claim was that no, the wage that the worker is getting is not only for his own reproduction, it is in fact enough for wife and children, and hence wife and children need not be doing anything other than being at home, being wageless, and being dependents. So one would have to, in other words, not just look in terms of a capitalist understanding of the issue, but also look at a patriarchal pact, as it were, even between workers and capitalists, bringing in a gender or a patriarchal understanding. So these kinds of debates were very much, very actively in the public realm in the 70s and 80s. There were radical feminists who used the ideas or the framework of Marxism and drew parallels with women. I mean, there were different ways in which, in fact, Marxism was drawn upon. Many of them saying that women formed a class, much as the working class formed a class in relationship to men. So this was a very rich period of theorizing, one could say, in the 1980s, which then, undergoes a profound loss of authority from the 1990s onwards. And this is largely seen as having been due to the the end of socialism in the fall of the Berlin Wall, other developments in the end of the Soviet Union, and so on. Changes in China, many nations that were associated with socialism, and of course the rise of a whole new phase of right-wing politics and right-wing thinking that had hitherto sort of not been as prominent, you could say. So in that climate, much of this retreats, and it is only now I would say, and many Western scholars pin it down to 2008, the financial crisis of 2008, which seems to have seen a new moment from having sort of been pushed back, from having lost ground. Marxism seems to be undergoing a revival. Theories of capitalism, didn't hear the word capitalism a great deal in the 90s into the 2000s, but now the word capitalism and capital is even being debated by people who are not necessarily Marxists. You have people like Piketty, for instance. And we have crises of capitalism now, financial crises and care crises. Interestingly, some of these concerns have been even more deeply articulated in the time of the pandemic, when everybody was forced to be at home, one way or the other, whether work from home, whether jobless at home, whether children having to be schooled from home. Very interesting then to read how much the home that feminists have been looking for visibility, that feminists have been saying we need to look at the space of the home as a sphere of work and reproduction and so on. And that has it worked. People have come to realize it almost experientially during the time of the pandemic, when indeed they were locked in, as it were, and and some could see for the first time all that was required for the home to be reproduced, or the kind of labors that were required that could be taken for granted earlier. So it's in that kind of context that we have seen in the last, I would say, decade or so, and more strongly now, ideas around labor, or ideas around the crises of capitalism, and ideas around women and women's work, housework, unpaid work, care work, and so on, find more space and more understanding and more acceptance. Why am I bringing all this here to you in a context of India? It is because the Indian story is actually a very difficult one to make sense of. Or rather, there are simple ways to make sense of the story in India. The story in India, which often, even when I used to present some of even the basic data around women's work in India. In fact, many of my colleagues, and not colleagues, I should not say that, not in CWDS, but others in the women's movement, were actually unaware of, which is that we in India have one of the lowest work participation rates in the world. I think the nations that are probably worse than us are only in West Asia. And I don't think anybody, feels any better if we say that our work participation rates are at least slightly better than Saudi Arabian women. Not only are our rates very low when it comes to paid work, they have been declining. They've been declining across the 20th century, and they have continued to decline. That is, I think, the most shocking aspect that is hard to get your head around. They have been declining in the very decades of the 90s and 2000s, which were our high growth decades. The very years that saw us go into double-digit numbers, the very years of so-called globalization and so on, that made for profound changes in our worlds, in standards of living for the middle classes, for sure. Those are the years that actually saw declining employment for women. It also flies in the face of popular, depictions of where women are in society. We have, the globalized woman today that you find in the media and so on is very much the financially independent woman. There's a way in which, in fact, a common sense way in which a certain notion of feminist independence and rights and so on has gained ground. So it's a very remarkable fact that in spite of this kind of image, this public image that most of us think is true, we think more and more job opportunities are coming women's ways these days, and more bastions are being broken, and women are entering them. But that is only true at the level of education. It is not true at the level of work. So there is a common sense answer to that. No, I mean, not. I don't think there's a common sense answer to the decline. There is a common sense answer to the fact that we have low work participation rates, which is simply to say that India is a traditional country in which women are supposed to be in the home, and that's their primary duty to look after family and so on, which I think is a very thin answer. I find it, especially if in fact that I mean, if that answer were an old answer and was slowly breaking down as we became more modern, it would at least have some traction to it. But why should it be more true today than it was 50 years ago or 30 years ago? So my colleagues and many of us are struggling over finding an answer to it. I think it has two parts. One is to re-articulate the question of the traditional understanding of why women are in the home, which, by the way, is more true. Just in case, just to emphasize the nature of the shocking nature of it, it is more true in urban India than in rural India. So our assumptions, of course, are that there are much more traditional constraints on women in rural contexts compared to urban metropolitan contexts, but that is not the case. There are more women earning some kind of remuneration in agriculture than they are in manufacturing or in services. Urban work participation rates are almost half of those of rural work participation rates. So here there is no, this is really something we can't sort of get away from. Here I want to say one aspect that I think needs to be redescribed or reanalyzed is it's not simply something called tradition and something called modernity, but there is a caste dimension to the nature of women's work in our country. That is to say, caste status goes hand in hand, and I'm talking even about modern ideas of caste status, goes hand in hand with negative indictment of women's presence in public labor. Public labor is stigmatized. So I have articulated this in some of my writing as a stigma theory of labor compared to a labor theory of value. Because women's public labor is thought of as working out of necessity. It's thought of as vulnerable. It's thought of as exposing yourself to strange men. And the fact, I would say, that today, to this very day, danger, being outside is associated with danger in our society, and of course violence is not far removed from that notion of danger, and safety is associated with the home. And the fact that this is not true, the fact that our data on violence would belie this completely, that in fact the most amount of violence that happens is in the domestic sphere and not in the public sphere, all of which is not the way we are socialized, not the way we think. So I believe that there is a caste dimension to this denigration, if you like, this association of public labor, especially if it is manual labor of any kind, agricultural work, other kinds of work, factory work, many forms of service work are thought of as lacking in status. So such that indeed the idea that you could escape that you do not need to be put in that kind of vulnerable position, you do not need to labor for the family, is considered a rise in status. I think this is one aspect of it. But the other aspect, which I think is really not understood well, is the nature of our economy itself. In other words, we have the kind of economy that is not, in fact, providing jobs. It is, one of the phrases has been that was used for the period of high growth from the 90s onwards, is jobless growth. And in fact, jobless growth was in fact the characteristic from the 90s onwards, when high growth rates went hand in hand with, new jobs were surely created, but as many or more other jobs were being lost. And now we have a new phrase, which is job loss growth, which is coming from the latest analysis of the latest NSS data from 2017-18, where actually there's an absolute, quite shocking, unheard of absolute loss in numbers of, in terms of work opportunities, within which the biggest losers are women. Very small gains, perhaps for very much more highly educated women, but losses for other women. So in this context of of declining work participation rates, job losses, and the caste stigma on women. The fact that the most, even in urban India as of now, the most common sources of work for women are either primary school teaching and secondarily paid domestic work. That is to say, assisting in this realm of housework. There, even if we, push even further the hidden domain of the home, there is an even more hidden domain of assistance to this domain, at least in middle and upper middle class households, which is the labor of the paid domestic worker who assists sometimes even an unpaid housewife in carrying out a range of duties that enable the reproduction of the home. This is indeed the most, and the numbers of those who are in better employment, in careers, in the media, in finance, and so on, are minuscule. Though they may be in our sort of common sense, they may be very visible. They are actually in the numbers are small. So this is the scenario that I believe needs theorizing, not just description, but theorizing. And I would want to bring together here the understanding of those Marxist feminists who have talked about the essential nature of the reproduction of society through the labor, unpaid work that is happening in homes. In other words, if we were to think of the labor of women in our homes, in our middle class homes today, not as something that needs to be shared with husbands or children primarily. Yes, there can be a gender concern here, but rather if we think of it as a giant subsidy to the form that capitalism is taking in our country, right? And secondly, if you recognize that the form of capitalism in our country, and here I'm drawing on the work of people like Kalyan Sanyal, who have said that the peculiar form that capitalism in our country has taken is one of exclusion of large proportions of those who like to be workers, who wouldn't mind being exploited as workers in our economies, but who are in fact have no place in our economy. So we have a form of capitalism that works through selective inclusion and large-scale exclusion. Large proportions of those who might want to are basically unemployed, unemployable, or have very, very tenuous relationships with work. I think one of those very tenuous relationships with work was made only too palpable during the lockdown, in the early days of the lockdown, when we saw large numbers of people thrown with nowhere to go. Basically, the migrants who had to trudge home or climb into buses or trains at great, risk to themselves, or walk on railway tracks. These were very, very large proportions of people whose relationship to work was extremely tenuous, and who could be excluded at will, and who were forced then to go back home because there was no home under lockdown conditions in urban contexts. So we have a form, I don't know whether to call it I think we should call it capitalism today, though we have never quite theorized what kind of economic society we have today, a form of capitalism that works through exclusion or works through very partial and very tenuous forms of inclusion. And within that, what I want to add to that is that the largest proportion of those who are excluded from being workers are women. So if you get my meaning, then if we want to theorize the current scenario, we must combine the fact of large proportions of women who want to work, because we are looking at changes. It is no longer simply a story of women who wish to be at home. There are many, many who, when you answer questionnaires and so on, would love to have a job if they could. But there is no job for them to find, or no job with any kind of decent prospects of a return in terms of a decent wage. So large proportions are at home because there is nowhere else for them to go. So we are seeing a situation of exclusion from capitalism in this mode, a form of capitalist exclusion, and a form of subsidy to this very capitalism through the housework and the related other forms of unpaid or highly underpaid work. So when you do have paid work, it will be domestic work, for which the wages that we all pay are perhaps probably the worst of any kind of wage that you can imagine. school teaching in government school teaching is surely not is surely a decent source of income, but in our private schools and elsewhere is also very, very poorly paid. And one of the reasons you can get away with such very poor levels of pay is because it is women who are occupying those spaces. So mostly unpaid, and when paid, highly underpaid. This is the structure, this is the capitalist and gender structure that we can try and get our heads around, with caste playing its own roles, if we want to try and make sense of this very strange world that we inhabit. When I speak to students, I feel particularly distressed, I have to say, because the contradiction between this kind of work scenario and the fact that education has been expanding by leaps and bounds. It is the only sphere in our Indian context that has seen something approaching parity. We have been, and IITs, though they are actually trailing, obviously these have been the most masculinist of spaces in higher education today. Even there are changes. And I don't know what the figures are in IIT Guwahati. But if you look at our public universities and our private universities and several other contexts, you will see in postgraduate, graduate, higher education situations that are actually very close to parity. And it's not just the B.Ed kinds of courses that are full of girls. Many other spaces are also. So education is surely being breached. The sphere of education today is a sphere that is being sought after by women, and it is even being sought after across social groups. Even those who were the most marginal, those who were the most excluded in the past, are finding their way, thanks to reservation policies or thanks to other modes in which parents are willing to invest in their daughters' education. We are seeing some profound change happening here, but it is not at all being reflected in the world of work. So what happens to students, women students, after their education is, for me, a big question mark. It does mean that well into the 21st century, marriage is the principal institution. The reproduction of the home through marriage is the principal institution for women to this very day. It also means that its form remains principally an intergenerational contract. It is not accidental that the so-called arranged marriage is alive and well in a country like ours, where it has broken down. This was an institution that was very widespread in many parts of the world. It has been breaking down over maybe the last 100 years, and in other parts of Asia and so on, maybe the last so many decades. There are no signs of its breakdown in India. Small numbers, maybe so-called falling in love and so on, but even that is very often in a relationship of replicating the very similar kind of marriage structure. So this is something we really need to look at. For those of us who also want to think of freedom from violence, freedom in so many ways, until and unless this picture is also theorized, is also understood, is also put on the table as absolutely central to thinking about more equality, more justice, my fear is that we won't be getting close to that. So I'll stop there, and I look forward to your questions, comments, and so on. Thank you.
Thanks so much, John. It's open for questions. You can maybe raise your hand, and we can call out, and then whoever has questions, they're free to ask. Yes, Rajshri, go ahead.
Hello.
Yes.
Hi. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi.
Can you just say your name so that, since I don't know you, I suppose you can't become visible, but I'll just hear you. Is that how it works?
Is two of you. One is that when you talked about the wages for housework politics of the Marxist feminists of the 1960s and the 1970s.
Yes.
Now we see a lot of institutionalization of the care economy in countries such as India today. So you have various kinds of scheme workers and so on. And it is reflected in the ways we have actually created, so to say, an army of scheme workers who are shouldering the care economy. So now, given this development that has happened over the period of last 1 or 2 decades or so, do you see this as the failure of the politics of the women's movement, that the Marxist feminist politics of wages for housework could not be reconciled with the radical feminist standpoint of inequality between the sexes? Was it because of this, because of this tussle between these two standpoints that we have reached a situation where there is an institutionalization of the care economy, so much so that we cannot, it looks like we cannot pass this moment anymore. We are moving towards more and more of so to say familialization of the care economy, the way it's happening. That's one question I wanted to ask you. And the second I wanted to ask you is that the financial crisis of 2008, now the analysis that has come up, it shows that it seemed to be like a men's crisis. The male workers seem to have lost more of their jobs during the financial crisis of 2008, and the pandemic driven unemployment seems to be more of a female crisis because it's the violence within the home sphere has increased, and it's the women within the households are more concerned about whether their men can go back to employment, irrespective of whether they themselves are going out for employment or not. So what is again the position of the feminist movement as such with regard to the theorization of these two kinds of development? So that's my question.
Well, I think you've raised big questions. So excellent. Thank you, Rajshri. On the familialism issue, I think we see failure. Let's not maybe use the word failure, because who has succeeded? I don't know who has succeeded in their politics today. Let's not go there on in terms of failure per se. I think in the Indian context, actually, we are at least. Let me say that I partly disagree with you in the sense that the fact of the Anganwadi and Asha workers forming an army of quote unquote voluntary workers has been an issue for everyone. I mean, has been an issue around which organizing has happened, and as a consequence of organizing, whether by left groups or others, their situation has at least gained visibility. The fact that they're being called, not even being called workers, being called voluntary helpers, and so on. The wages that, the honorarium, see, it was never called a wage, it was called an honorarium, was an issue that has been, in fact, I think even this particular government has made declarations of improving the honorarium. So actually that has achieved focus. But what I think we have, and the issue that has exercised economists, women studies scholars from the 80s onwards, is how to measure and give value to all the work that women do, especially in rural contexts, where production is within the household and beyond, collection of fuel and fodder, all the many collecting water, all kinds of, in fact, even economic activities that women carry out that don't get to count So I think there have been levels and layers of actual intervention and change. But the curious thing is that I think where we have failed, if that is the word we should use, it is in thinking about the home in its most standard form, in its urban, middle or working class form, the so-called housewife. The fact that the vast proportion of our population are indeed housewives has somewhere escaped us. And so we have been more concerned to give economic value to all the many, those especially in situations of poverty, and those whose wages are so obviously underpaid or not even recognized, like your scheme workers. So we have gone into, but somewhere the nature of housework and its relationship to not its relationship to other members of the family so much as its relationship to the reproduction of capitalism, the version of capitalism that we have. That I believe we have really not named, and some of us still would not want to acknowledge it. We also, if you can see, there was a debate recently, I think a face-off between Prabha Kutishwaran and Ashwini Deshpande in the Times of India, I think a few weeks ago. So it's very interesting that here on the one side you have Prabha Kutishwaran saying we must have wages for housework, and we have on the other side an equally feminist economist saying everything is wrong with the idea. It's partly, of course, to gain brownie, to gain visibility in terms of debating. But the fact that someone could say everything is wrong with the idea of wages for housework is, to me, curious. And there'll be people who will say, whereas people are trying to say that it is patriarchy that is enabling women to continue in this unpaid status. The people respond to the demand for wages by saying you're confining women to the home, you're giving them a wage to stay at home. This is even more patriarchal. So we haven't gone very far actually in actually naming the problem and getting our heads around it. So if there's a failure, definitely there's a failure there. It was interesting the way you described 2008 and then to 2020. Was the financial crisis seen as primarily a crisis for male workers? I don't know, in the sense that you see in Western societies, the female workforce is, there is parity. There's parity in terms of numbers, certainly not in terms of pay, but there is certainly parity. Women are as active in the workforce as men are, under adverse conditions, no doubt, with double burdens, no doubt. But there is, we have to look at a situation where they take for granted that most women enter the workforce at some point in their lives, with all the difficulties of managing the home, of deciding when they want to become mothers. In fact, having children in Western societies has become a huge issue. Not having a partnership, not of whatever nature, but women are postponing having children to later and later ages, and so on, because that has still not been, and that is an indication of the failure there of acknowledging care work, of acknowledging the house, of acknowledging all of that. And women are trying to be like men, as it were. So the financial crisis of 2008, of course, was primarily thought of as a banking crisis, and it was banks that were being saved, and the house loan crisis. So I'm not sure whether or not it was only I think families were also seen as part of this crisis when they lost their homes. But I think you're absolutely right about the funny way in which 2020 pandemic brought the home into public view, because everybody was in the home. And suddenly we were talking about, yes, there is more domestic violence, as though this domestic violence didn't pre-exist at the pandemic. So that I did, and the fact of care for children, because they had to be schooled from home. This was a huge, I think this has been a major, so women with young children, more perhaps even than violence against men, women with young children became a huge issue. You could talk about it now. You could talk about it at great length, because you were now having to supervise their classwork, their homework, day in and day out. What school teachers must have had to be doing with those very children in a school, that suddenly found, all of which had been taken for granted, what it means to teach children, and all that goes into that, and what you get in return. The fact that school teaching is demoted, is thought of as an extension of care, and not as requiring enormous skill in order to teach a young child. I think all of these you're absolutely right, that all of this suddenly became something that people just talked about at great length. One of the big questions for me is what will happen when so-called normalcy returns? Will there be lessons that will be kept? Will we just go back to a new normal? And what would that look like? These are I don't have a clear answer for that. And my fear, I don't know, I'm being a little pessimistic nowadays, I think, in my old age, that some of this will actually be forgotten. And that people will just grab whatever is available in this new world, and maybe not, or reduce the problem to this very simplistic, which I call the simplistic solution, which was very interesting in India, because there was a big spike in the sale of these stand-up mops once the pandemic hit. The stand-up mop with a bucket now. You even had it with a bucket. It was all very, very nice and spiffy. So you could stand up and clean the floor. And I think this was when the domestic worker was prevented from coming any longer to your home because of the pandemic. And men who wanted to be a little sensitive, they recognized that this labor needed to be done, but they were not going to bend down and use a pocha. They were not going to do that kind of thing. They were going to use a nice modern technology to clean floors. And so I wonder what will happen to those stand-up mops and so on once your maid servants come back. Will they be given those mops to clean with?
Or
Or
the,
will they be...
or they may be, or this technology might perhaps displace the so-called domestic maid
Yes,
and bring women
perhaps.
back into the home sphere. Yeah.
Yeah, no, or various possibilities are there. So these are very curious, very interesting developments whose longer term are we politicizing these questions? Are we actually thinking them through? Is very interesting to me. So I'll stop there because you've raised
Thank
so
you.
many
Thank
issues.
you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Rohini, please go ahead.
Thank you for a wonderful lecture, Professor John.
Thank you. Can I
I
see
just
you?
had.
Is it okay? It makes a difference to me.
I'm sorry. I'm actually doing this from home, and
Okay,
I
fine.
don't think I'm
Okay.
very presentable.
I
Yeah.
can hear you. So
So yeah, I'm so sorry about that.
no.
So basically, yeah, I actually had a couple of comments.
Yes.
One was and what happened during the pandemic, of course. I was wondering, with the change in the capitalist structure and the kind of manufacturing that we've been having, that's been followed so far, which may be threatened with imminent change. I was wondering the kind of outsourcing of some of the capitalist manufacturing jobs that perhaps some women do from home in urban clusters in the cities, right?
Yes.
So this is sort of camouflaged, labor which women do in addition to their domestic chores. Women who are maybe not very highly educated, maybe women who live in the slum tenements. I'm thinking of places like Ahmedabad, where the textile industry has always been there, where women employ themselves. So that is one of the sources of employment which perhaps has not been acknowledged, and which is always papered over, and I don't know to what extent. I mean, these jobs they must have lost these jobs during the pandemic, and what will happen once these modes of manufacture change. So I was just wondering aloud about these sources of possible payment for women's work.
Yes.
And the second that I was thinking of was through the 90s, we may not have heard of capitalism much, but from, I think, through the 90s and the 2000s, perhaps there has been mobilization under caste rubrics. For instance, Dalit women mobilizations that maybe happened in large parts of Maharashtra, for instance.
Yes. Yes.
I don't know whether we could also think of these. I know
Yes.
you did refer to caste, but I have a
Yes.
feeling maybe in India one has seen more mobilizations under these heads rather
Yes.
than yeah. So this will give some of the
Okay.
basic
Okay.
areas that I thought I could
Yeah, excellent.
touch on.
So I think your
Yeah.
first question is about what we call home-based work.
Yes.
That's not so much outsourcing. When we say outsourcing, we are referring more to the US outsourcing, their
Yeah,
work.
sure,
So this is
sure. So I
home-based work.
said certain kinds of work which women, let's say,
Yes. Yeah.
spooling yarn or thread or certain
Yeah.
bits of
Yeah.
embroidery or
I mean, the older ones are beady rolling.
beadi or agarbatti and
Agarbatti.
toys or certain
Yes.
bits of
Yes.
embroidery.
Yes.
Yeah, those kind of
Yes.
things.
No,
Yeah.
you're quite right to point to this area. I think it has been it has been a subject of some research. Its scope is not perhaps sufficiently known, um, and it is a very significant. It's very significant way in which then the housewife could circumvent caste, as it were, did not have to step outside, and could augment could earn something via home-based work that was being supplied through a chain from the owner downwards through the middle. There were various middlemen, sometimes middle women,
Various,
various
yeah,
levels of middle women
various
involved.
levels of middle.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's very
and
interesting.
if I'm sorry to interrupt you, but just to add to this, I mean, this is very different from the kind of thing that Seva does, for instance, in Ahmedabad, where
Yes, yes,
so that is a
yes,
more
yes.
organized kind of network.
Correct.
Yeah, sorry,
Yeah. No.
sorry. Yeah.
Seva is cutting is about enabling self-employed, as the word
Yeah,
self-employed
yeah,
women. That's what Seva stands for. So
yeah.
self-employed women would be women who are engaging in self-employment of various kinds, production of something of their own, for sale, which is then receiving credit and other forms of support from SEVA as the overall. Yes, absolutely. This is manufacturing, as you say. This is manufacturing being sort of broken down, where some parts of it, and it could be the buttons of shirts that have been, that are going to end up in the first world. In fact, one of the most interesting examples of this early analysis of this was by a German feminist called Maria Mies, whose book called The Lace Makers of Narsapur was a very fascinating example of producing lace doilies that then made their way to the first world. And where the hyper exploitation that is possible under these conditions, because it is housewives who are not worth, whose value is nothing, the rates, the extent of the exploitation, the thousands of BDs you have to roll, or agarbattis that you have to roll, or the thousands of buttons that you have to stitch for a next, what we would think of as nothing, 50 rupees, and so on. That is absolutely right. I don't know. I imagine there was a breakdown in that during the pandemic, but I'm imagining it. I don't know the facts here, because if there was lockdown, then surely this would have been locked down as well. Is this being revived? And under what terms? This would be I have no answer for you here. This would be a very interesting question to ask. If in fact it was possible for capitalists to actually make profits by this degree of overexploitation of women's labor at home. And women would say this is nice for them to do because they can do it side by side with looking after their children.
Exactly.
And in fact, children, it's also a source of child labor. So in certain families, children would be doing this activity too. So I don't know the answer to that. It's a very interesting question. What new shape would this take now, if indeed it was brought to an end by virtue of the lockdown? Capitalism and Dalit women. This is a very interesting question. And in fact, this is a larger question. If indeed the term capitalism receded even in the first world, even the US, the critiques of capitalism of the 1980s tended to recede in the 1990s, post, what was sometimes called the post-socialist, Nancy Fraser has this phrase, post-socialist condition, when existing socialisms seem to throw a spanner in the works of thinking about a capitalist critique. And capitalism seemed to be the only game in town now with the end of the Soviet Union and so on. It is that very era that saw the rise of what has been called identity politics, very simplistically, which is to say movements around new identities, demanding rights, demanding justice, and race, for instance, as an issue, becomes much more visible in its own right in the 1990s in countries like the US, even though, of course, it has a century-long history. So don't get me wrong here. But people of color, women of color, and so on become a much more active category from the late 80s into the 90s and so on. And it's interesting if you think in India, too, that Dalit women's organizing does find a face in the 1990s. National Dalit women's organizations are formed. Again, this is not to say that there wasn't before, but they were much more regionally confined. They were part and parcel of the Ambedkarite movement in the case of Maharashtra, and suffered, I think, a setback when Ambedkarite politics also had a setback in the 70s and 80s. And with the revival of Dalit politics in the 1990s, after Mandal and after other forms of revival in terms of the Dalit question, reservations, and many other issues, it is very true that Dalit women's issues have also gained ground. Have they? The big question is, in my mind, and this is where I have a problem with people like Nancy Fraser. Nancy Fraser has actually articulated a critique of identity politics, claiming almost that it has been a handmaiden of neoliberalism, that it has been at the cost of critiques of capitalism. And I think that is a very, very dubious claim to make. The fact that critiques of capitalism took a backseat in the 1990s has to be understood in its own terms. Why was it that, in fact, that happened? Why was it that working class struggles became right-wing struggles? I mean, these are some of the most, I should say, some of the biggest puzzles of our time, that the working classes no longer see a future in right-wing leaders rather than in Marxist leaders. So yes, there has been a rise, but I don't think that rise has been in order to by. Let me put it this way: Dalit women are. It's not that Dalit women are uninterested in capitalism or uninterested in working or in labor rights. And I heard from Basudhara that land is an area of interest for her. So economic rights, land rights, these have been very much on the agenda, surely by Dalit women. But the fact that we are not very clear about how to describe our economy. Should we call it, because we've often think it's still feudal. We have so many feudal elements in our economy. We have a colonial history that has distorted the kind of capitalism that we have. We are much more comfortable using this word neoliberalism today. Globalization, everybody uses these words. So I find it interesting that we don't seem to want to use the word capitalism. I think we should use it and not skirt around it. So I hope I've answered your question.
Thank you. I wonder if the farmers' movement is doing anything to the Dalit movement as well. So
yes,
I have hopes. I have hopes there. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. Yes.
Thanks, Rohini. So we have a couple of questions also from YouTube Live where it's showing. So I'll just take Kendra, we'll just come to you. I'll just take a couple from YouTube and then we'll come back to you. So Priyanka says, thank you, Dr. John, for this great lecture. Given the context of jobless growth, low work participation of women, what are the kinds of social mobilities women are experiencing in contemporary India? She's also asking, can there be links drawn between Black feminist theory and social reproduction, like what Angela Davis writes about Black women? They are chattel, labor producing units, breeders, not seen as women. Can we imagine a link between these two standpoints to describe what is happening in India with women's work taking on caste and gender dimensions?
Yes. So,
could I read out one more question?
Yeah, okay, sure. Absolutely. Yes.
Okay. And then there's a question from Jeannie that says private creche pay decent amount to women working in urban settings. So why not give professional recognition to Anganwadi workers as well?
Yes. Okay. So to Priyanka, your question about Angela Davis and social, absolutely. I think the work needs to be done more carefully. The way in which, as a consequence of the history of slavery in the U.S., the form that labor. So Black women didn't have. I mean, Black people had no families. The family form was destroyed. Was not allowed to even take shape because of the institution of slavery. And children born of slaves did not belong to their mothers. I mean, we have to try and imagine that kind of an economy, a very modern, by the way, economy built on slavery, as a consequence of which the nature of the Black family in countries like the US is very, very unique. And the way in which Black women would like the family to be thought of does not mesh very neatly with a standard account of say, a radical notion of the family as the site of patriarchy. Because indeed the family itself there was no family, and historically, and the very idea of forming bonds, and having, and of course even today the Black family is pathologized because of high rates of crime, the high proportions of men who are in jail in the Black community. So how do we think about social? I think you're absolutely right that a genuine social reproduction theory would need to then find a specific articulation of the nature of the labor that is being done in these kinds of homes. And indeed, the labor, if you think about the fact that Black women were working at least in the southern states of the US, uh, they were, I don't know if you've seen the film The Help, or the book The Help, which is all about Black women's labor in white women's households. So the fact that there were a large proportion of Black women who were actually laboring in such households for the reproduction of those households, and in that form also for their own reproduction, all of that would have to find its way into a social reproduction theory. And I think one could think in parallel terms. When I read The Help, I was thinking in parallel terms about the caste question in India, the fact that most of the worst forms of the cleaning of our households is also done by Dalit women. So a lot of the paid domestic work is done by lower caste women in our context, not unlike Black women in the past in the US. You asked the question about social mobility, what is to be done, what would declining work participation rates in India mean? And my very simple and harsh answer to you is that it means that marriage as an institution will continue to be as compulsory as ever. It means that we need to take on board the compulsory nature of the marriage institution, because that then becomes the principal site of social mobility. Let me put it as harshly as possible. It's the principal site of social mobility, and the principal qualification that goes towards, for those who are upwardly mobile, is education. Education, the credentialing that women gain through education, is critical for the marriage market. Let us think of marriage in India as a market, and let us look at the role that education plays now in that market, and imagine the hierarchical nature of that marriage market and the kind of credentials. So we will have situations where highly qualified women will be actually using that high qualification, even as doctors, even as IAS officers, even as IT consultants. A lot of that gets translated into an excellent marriage proposal. It may or may not mean a job. It does not require a woman's degree, to this very day, does not require its translation into a good job. This is unfortunately the fact. And I do not believe that we have looked at this really. And I know many people I know who have quite readily withdrawn, even from job prospects, have withdrawn into a relationship of mobility where they have allowed the men to continue to work, and they have taken on the job of reproduction and transferred many of their ambitions into the upbringing of their children, so that their children then, and this is, I'm talking now, upper middle class, upper class urban families, highly educated women who will be striving for their children to become IIT graduates or whatever, right? Rather than, so I hope you get the point I'm making. So social mobility then gets as it were transferred to children, as in this context of jobless growth. So that's my answer to that, and it's one that I genuinely believe we must look at, because it's us. I'm not now talking about the urban poor or the rural poor. I'm talking about us. I'm talking about the fact that look around in your own spaces. I mean, maybe do a little. I don't know if you'd like to do a little census of. I mean, I don't know if it's a tricky thing to do even in a campus like Guwahati IIT. What are the men and women in amongst all in your community? Who's doing what in those families? It might be a very telling answer, and it's not a place we really want to go. The question of private creches and Anganwadi workers. Well, private creches are few and far between. It's something that really needs attention. And I was shocked. I'm from South India, and I also, I had a young child, and I was actually in Hyderabad when I had a young child. My partner at the time was at Hyderabad Central University, and then we moved to Delhi. So I'm just speaking anecdotally here. It wasn't so difficult for me in Hyderabad, where we were living, to find a woman who was willing to, I'm talking now a creche, not just a creche-like arrangement for my son at the age of when he was 2 or 3 years old, because I just wanted a little time to myself. But it was very much harder to find that arrangement here in Delhi, for instance. Creches are very creches. So what is a creche? What is considered? It's much more common to find paid domestic workers of a higher level, nannies, if you like, and other such, who are who in your own home are doing the job of looking after children in upper middle class homes, compared to the poor children who are then sent to the Anganwadis. So the Anganwadi is seen as just a space for the child. And these are highly class differentiated things. So what the expectation one would have, if you are from a middle class background, what expectation you would have of what is to be provided by a nursery school, say a pre-nursery nurse, and all of those things, as distinct from an Anganwadi center. We would have to look into all of those things to then ask ourselves, why is it that an Anganwadi worker is paid what she is and is not thought of as a worker? And I actually don't know how well paid creche are people even in a pre-nursery school, whatever space. How well do they pay the women in these spaces? I actually don't know. Are they paid very well? I have no idea, because I think there's a lot of exploitation that will be going on there as well.
Okay, thank you so much. Tikendra, would you like to go ahead?
Yes. Hello, good evening, ma'am. I am Tikendra. I am pursuing my masters in IIT Guwahati only. So,
yes,
as you mentioned, rightly mentioned that our economy is not producing jobs, and
yes,
also you mentioned that capitalism is also excluding the people who want to work,
yes,
and you also mentioned like masculine nature of the premier institution of India. So, yeah, so by relating this the excluding from the job and the masculine nature of these premium institutions, so many often the capitalist market system uh, means give excuse of for excuse as entrepreneurship development, entrepreneurial cultural development of for the job creation and all, by keeping in mind that entrepreneurship give opportunity to use and utilize the economic ideas of the individual to generate economy. So my first question is related with this, like if brief view of Marxist scholar in the present day entrepreneurial culture, and
mm,
how it is affecting the capitalist system,
yes.
and how does it affect the gender relation and occupational mobility, particularly to the women in this capitalist economy.
Yeah. No, that's a very important question.
Should we take one more question from Prathana has raised her hand? Would that be okay?
Yeah, okay. Let me just write this down then.
Okay.
Yeah, okay. Next question. Sure. All right.
Prathana, go ahead.
Ma'am, am I audible?
Yeah.
Yes.
I just want to share with you my thoughts on the ideas on housework. I think that housework, regardless of whether it is paid, unpaid, recognized, not recognized, in terms of its economic value, is very problematic. In the ideal situation, everybody should clean their own sheet, like except in the exceptional cases. So, do you think that demands for wages for housework or decent pays for domestic help are sufficient enough to legitimize housework? I think housework, and particularly tasks like dishwashing, mopping the floor, has an inherently dehumanizing element, very similar to the works that Dalits do in serving the upper caste, in cleaning their sheets like in manual scavenging. Uh, okay, that's it.
Okay. Very different questions. So entrepreneurship is I haven't studied entrepreneurship, but what I think is being done by our state policies is to offer, when they know that indeed there is jobless or job loss growth, is to offer entrepreneurship. And I'm sure this must be true for IIT graduates, is that they offer entrepreneurship as the way forward. And what does that mean? That means you don't get to join a capitalist workplace. You are supposed to start as a mini capitalist, right? If you're talking capitalism, what does entrepreneurship mean? It means that you're a capitalist of a certain size, self capital. I mean, you have to work out a way in which either you individually or you with others are going to set up some kind of an establishment, some kind of a firm, some kind of a production unit on your own, where you become the capitalist. Either self-exploitation in the sense that you're the only person doing what you're doing, and hopefully it's going to work and create value, and you're going to the self-exploitation is not so high that indeed it doesn't lead to bankruptcy, or you have good schemes of credit and in other ways that you're able to cope. But much of this entrepreneurship is very, I think and there is an there are entrepreneurship schemes that are definitely directed towards women, but they end up being the ones that are directed towards women end up being again extremely narrow, small, directed towards pickle and papad, and that would be my critique of the Seva model, that it actually works on very, very limited, very small scale of operation. Or we have the other institution, which is not exactly entrepreneurship. We have the self-help group, the SHGs. The SHGs has been the government's, if the government has offered Narega as a scheme to ward off the worst aspects of no jobs in rural India by offering 100 days of wages at a certain rate, minimum wage rate, primarily addressing men, to some extent women, but primarily, except for the state of Kerala, where you see women doing Narega work. Elsewhere, it's mostly men. You have the SHG model, that is the group model where women are supposed to get together, save. And these are pretty much housewives who get together, save money, and pool it for certain purposes, sometimes productive, but mostly to tide over various needs that they may have. Those are the models that we have. Those are the models that are out there. So I would like to, I think something like entrepreneurship needs to be looked at much more. My sense is that, and I haven't studied it, so I will not claim something about. But my feeling is that the entrepreneurship model is not doing well at all, and that, and I would even add the fact that we have what we call NPAs, non-performing assets from banks. What are these? These are monies that are being taken and provided as loans for companies to start up in various forms. Of course, some of it is being offered to extremely successful companies who then actually do very badly. But some of it may be loans to smaller persons to actually do a startup. And the question then is, why are those doing so poorly? Why aren't we? Why isn't self-employment the answer to the problem? That's the question we must ask. If indeed there are the standard salaried job, which is what most people wish to get. Everybody wants a salaried government, and a government job would be even better. Those are shrinking all the time. What is it about entrepreneurship and its potential and the credit systems that are supporting it that are not working? And what is it about the ways in which a very stereotypical notion of what women could do as entrepreneurs? What is going on there? I think that needs more study than I am able to offer you. That I think they exist, but I can't say more than my sense that is not taking care of the problem of jobless growth. Okay, so the question on the problematic nature of housework, that we should clean our own shit and so on. I think you're conflating different aspects of things. Yes, we are in a position to displace the most onerous, the worst, dirtiest aspects of the reproduction of the home to others. So it's within the family. It's often done to the women. So men may displace it onto the women. Women, if they're in a position to do so, if they're middle class, will displace it onto others below them, within which cleaning toilets is one part of that. So you're saying the answer to the problem is everybody should do their own housework. That is precisely the kind of answer I was hoping nobody would tell me, because that only means that you are self-subsidized. In terms of the analysis I'm trying to give you, is not that was what I was trying to say. The answer is not sharing in the work of the home per se. The nature of housework is such as to be a gigantic subsidy to capitalism. So So if you are doing it yourself, that doesn't change it. The fact that you may be, if every individual were to be doing this work on their own, it simply means a self, that you are providing that subsidy yourself to capitalism. So if you are if you are, and you're assuming, in when you're saying this, you're assuming that you have other sources of income, right? You're assuming that you are a worker, or employed in some fashion, and sufficiently well employed to be able to do the work for what you're employed for, and to also do all the other work that goes into the reproduction of your life. You're assuming that the pay and the time and the nature of your work is such as to be perfectly compatible with all the labor that is required for the reproduction of the home, right? So the care crisis and the housework crisis that is happening in the world, across the world today, is precisely because it is no longer possible to do all this. One person cannot be expected to do employment work and to be able to do all the labor that goes into the reproduction of the household, from care of people, from cooking, from cleaning, to the toilets as well, right? So the fact, and the fact that certain kinds of people, that is women primarily, and in a class, or in a caste or race differentiated society, there will be further displacements onto others, does not answer the question of how that work should be valued, right? It's not the, it's, yes, a lot of it is drudgery, a lot of it is dirty work, a lot of it should be either eliminated in certain, or reduced through technology and so on. All of that is quite true, but it doesn't, that is not the only thing that is the problem here. You will still have, even if you remove the drudgery aspect of it, or the dirty aspect of it, that is not going to make your homes get you, that doesn't end the question of how to value all the work that will still be required to reproduce the space that you live in, right? And it is that is going unacknowledged. It is that capitalism is relying on in the wages that it is giving you. It is assuming that the wages that you get are also sufficient to reproduce this aspect of your life. And that is what we are questioning. And it's certainly in India, where the wages that are being paid for this kind of work are extremely low. They certainly do not match up to the nature of the work that is being done. So it's the subsidy aspect that I'm trying to get you to think of, not just the drudgery or onerous nature or the dirty nature of the work. So we ought to be paying, let me turn it around, we ought to be, and not all of it can be done oneself, the cleaning of drains and so on, that is absolutely essential to urban life today, and which is being done by Dalits at sometimes at fatal cost to themselves. We get reports of going down a manhole and suffocating because of the methane in these sewers. That is not going to be something that you can do yourself, right? That is work that ought to be modernized to the extent possible, or to get the requisite technology, the requisite safety equipment, and the requisite pay that should go with such work. Okay, so I hope you got my point.
Thank you so much. So we're running a little short of time. We have 3 questions that people had written down earlier. So I can read them, and if you'd like to very quickly sort of briefly respond to them. One is from Manohar, who's joining us. He's from Dibrugarh University, in the Department of Political Science, and his question is, where there is a system of or why isn't the system of equal pay for equal work and wage parity followed, along with this, which also then denies the lack of equal status of citizenship, with the assumption that the employers are educated. So why do educated people do this, not follow a principle of equality in payment? The other question is from Archita, who is our MA student in our department, who says, ma'am, you mentioned how the working classes are increasingly turning to right-wing leaders and right-wing politics to sort of represent their struggles. How do we make sense of this, given that right-wing politics almost always draws its leaders from the most privileged? And a third question is from what I can see is he's a PhD student at the Center for CSE, Science Engineering. I don't know what the full form of CSE. Computer Science Engineering, right?
Okay.
He says, respected ma'am, we find that never there has been a time when men and women have been paid for housework it is, I think, good in the sense that such a mechanism would eventually define love in terms of money, because what we do for the family, we do from love, and the greatest expression of love is through service. And such services demand sacrifice, which is one of the basis of improved civilization. Thus, such services, I think, should be recognized through love and not through wages. Kindly share your views on this.
Okay. Yes. Oh boy. All right. I don't know. Equal pay for equal work is a demand everywhere. It's not that it's not there. I mean, and informal employment, I think it's more or less there. A lecturer in our universities, in formal levels of employment, whether you're a man or a woman, you will get whatever the level is. You will get that level of work. So it's not that we have laws that say that it's okay for, our constitution has equal pay for equal work. It was the US that had a hard time of, finally ratifying the ERA, as it was called. And that was one of the big struggles of the 80s and so on, because each state had to ratify it. And there were conservative states that actually didn't believe this. They didn't believe that women should get equal pay, that women should be housewives, and they should be ready. All the things that the third person was saying, that things should be done at home for love, and no pay should be asked for. And that they don't even need to enter the public world of work. They were very right-wing Christian and other kinds of groups in countries like the US for very long, that prevented these basic. You think these are the basic, building blocks of a society to say that if you're doing the same kind of work, you should get the same pay. The issue of equal pay for equal work is actually more complicated, because the problem is that women are invariably in female-defined sectors. They're invariably in lower levels of a given work. After all, a workplace is a highly complex hierarchical structure. So if it's an IT workplace, for instance, the women will be invariably at the lower end of that IT structure, somewhere doing data entry, compared to where the men are. And the reasons that they are in that section has also to do with the fact that their responsibilities do not only end in the workplace, but that they have other so-called responsibilities in the home. So we are back to that whole issue of what then that work in the home counts for, and how much that is valued, which produces a situation where there is inequality in effect. Even if the laws of the land are equal pay for equal work, you're not at that same level. The boss, as you go up a work hierarchy, it becomes more and more masculine. So that's the problem with this situation. The fact that the working classes have become a right wing is not so much about the privilege. It's a phenomenon. It's a phenomenon that began or was first visible in a country in the UK with what was called Thatcherism. Margaret Thatcher was a right-wing politician, a conservative right-wing politician, who took over from Labour, from the previous era of Labour, where in the 60s and 70s, which was much more left-led, and where the working classes were much more felt that their concerns were being represented by Labour leaders. The tremendous shift happened when she was able to get the support of the working classes for carrying out policies that were anti-working class. So this is the most, and of course in the US today, the most remarkable example of that is the Trump phenomenon. The fact that someone like that could gain his major source of support was from working class white people. So this has been a conundrum for many. There are books and books written on this, on what is it and why, the Labour Party in England today, which seeks to represent the interests of the working class. Its membership is almost entirely middle class, right? So it's a very, very strange, in one level, situation that we find ourselves in. And I don't think we've got our heads around it. We don't fully understand it. I don't know if I'm treading now on anybody's toes, but one of the things that many of us tried to understand when it happened was demonetization in our country, and what it meant when overnight, people lost what they had, or their money no longer counted, and was not as worthless, and had to be exchanged in the name of the nation. And the fact that people fell in line here, that people agreed with this, even at considerable cost to themselves. That is to say, there was visible suffering that this caused, and yet people agreed in the name of doing something right by the nation. So I think that we need to I think the biggest challenge for us as social scientists is to recognize that what may be an economic disadvantage, what we would calculate with our rationality as an obvious economic disadvantage, is accepted by those by many in the name of some other value that they hold on to. So they hold on to the value of that this is good for the nation, even if they don't understand why. It's good for the nation, and therefore they are willing to suffer. And this is I think this is a situation that we are not used to thinking, because we would imagine that if you're suffering, you're going to protest. The relationship to something bad happening ought to be a relationship of protesting in the name of something better, and that is not the case. So even I gave the example of the migrant workers during the lockdown, something that shocked so many when these when their job losses and the fact that they had no place to live meant that they had to just en masse make their way back home across hundreds of miles. There were very few protests. They just went back home, and they didn't protest the injustice. I mean, what could be more unjust than to be in such a situation? And there were very few protests. I mean, there were a few, I think, in South India here and there, but there were hardly any protests. So I think it's a much larger, much more difficult phenomenon. The fact, and leaders may or may not be privileged. Trump is obviously a very rich man, but not all the leaders of today, including our current prime minister, has a history of not being a very privileged person. And he talks about that history that he had in his own growing up. So these are I think these are the toughest questions actually of the times that we are in. That and I would say that also translates into situations like the third question, the fact that many women are completely and totally anti-feminist. That many women would rather suffer in the home, serve their members in their home, believe it is their ultimate duty to be there for others and to always take the back seat, always eat last and least, be there for others, and that is where they get their greatest satisfaction from. And when we say no, you need you must demand your rights, no, you must have your own space, there is a complete mismatch between what we are saying and what many women are willing to accept. So, and love is a very complicated word. I don't know if there's time to get into that. What do we do in the name of love? And why should love imply service? Why should love imply duty? Why should it not be possible to say I love you, and I care for you and I wish the very best for you, but why should it be at cost of myself? Why should my expression of my love for you be an abasement of myself? Why should I have to lower myself, put myself last in order to prove my love for you? And why should you be looking for that kind of love from me? I think this is definitely it is very widespread. It exists, which is why I also, when people say love marriages are the solution to arranged marriages, I disagree, because I see in many love marriages the complete reproduction of the very same sets of relationships. In fact, sometimes they get even reinforced. Let me even push further to say that in a relationship of that sort, where you have defied or gone against family wishes, the woman is even more in a situation where she wants to prove how loving, how dutiful, how caring she is. She'll be caring to the husband, she'll be caring to her own family, she'll be caring to her in-laws, to prove that indeed was the right decision that she took, and is all at her own cost. So this is a very, very, very tricky terrain. It's a terrain that is not only economic, but it's also social, it's also emotional, it's many levels here. And what I do agree with is that I think this is the area that we haven't understood well enough, which is why our formulas for thinking about how campaigns should be led and how protests should be led and how people should be fighting are not often working out the way we imagine they might. But I totally agree that these are tough questions. But the point about it shouldn't be paid is not the reason there was a wages for housework movement was not because there is no love in the it's not because of love. If It's because this is a essential aspect of the reproduction of society. So if you love your employer, are you going to tell your employer, don't pay me? Why does that not work there? Why does it only work here? So surely, so you may respect and care for your superiors, but surely you wish to get your pay packet. So the fact that there should be recognition of the work that is being done in the home does not take anything away from the care and love that you may have for those people. I don't know if I've answered you, but
No. So, thank you so much, Professor John. We've had a really engaging and really interesting discussion from students, colleagues, everyone together. And also, I think we had a wider participation beyond our department today, I noticed, so that was really nice. In fact, there are some more questions, but since we're running out of time, I haven't done this before, and I'm sorry, but I also want to thank Rubul, who is our technical person, who we are holding back from going home by extending the meeting. So we're not taking those few couple of questions that just came in. And also thank you to Varsha, who's been designing our posters for these talks. Thank you so much, Professor John. It was so nice. And I'm glad that from last year when we were trying to bring you for Women's Day, that we finally managed to have you over. So thanks so much, and thanks everyone for attending.
Yeah, thank you, Sundara, and thanks to all of you for excellent questions. So, yeah.
Thank you.